Well, thank you guys for joining. Appreciate Joe for setting this up, and what an awesome turnout we've got. Obviously, a topic that is important to everybody right now, especially if you're in the ventilator business, aspiring to be in the ventilator business, or some people may be scared to death. One of the reasons we put this together is that as we kind of have an interesting pulse on the industry because we talk to everybody from nationals to the smallest ventilator providers in the country. And what we figured out in the last 6 months is some people are we're born ready for this and we're ready when it came. Some people have been getting ready, and then others are not ready at all. And so one of the reasons we decided to put this together was because we still are talking to DMEs that when we talk about the NCD, they don't even know what it is, and they're ventilator providers, or they've heard about it but not done anything about it. So we wanted to start putting out some education. We're going to do regular education, respiratory DME outcomes education. This one is really focused on the NCD compliance. So I'm going to talk about go over the NCD a little bit. For some of you guys, it'll be just a quick review, and then I'm going to get into some data. So one of the things that we've got is an interesting perspective of again of kind of seeing data from a high level. If you think about Encore Healthcare, we are we've been in the outcomes business for a long time, 10 years now. And one of the things when we started is that we saw that in the future there was going to be a need for outcomes, a need for data. And so, myself, I've been in the ventilator business my whole life. I tell people since I was in diapers, I grew up in the DME business, family of respiratory therapists. My father and uncle started their first DME the year I was born. And so I've been in this business for a long time and specifically been in respiratory. Not ever done a lot of sleep, not ever done, any kind of bent metal. It's always been respiratory focused and ventilation focused. And so this is what I've done my entire life. And because of that, we've got to see on the provider side. I started out on the provider side, had a very successful ventilation business with the company I was with previously, and then built Encore as a company in the Nexus software to really start to focus on outcomes. And one of the things that we've had is that we started early before outcomes were really a topic, right? It was when readmissions first started, and we recognized the writing on the wall that the future was going to be about outcomes. And so we started to track outcomes. Really, if you think about Encore, early on we partnered with the elite DMEs who were seeing the future was about outcomes, and we partnered with the DMEs who were really interested in setting themselves apart because outcomes are an organic growth engine for your business. And so we've been tracking outcomes on respiratory populations for about 10 years. We probably got somewhere close to 15% of the home ventilator market share in the United States is managed in Nexus today. So pretty decent market share of patients. And we've got some really good data. A lot of our data in the past has been focused on reductions in readmissions, hospitalizations, that kind of thing. You can see down at the bottom on 144,000 patients, we reduced hospitalizations by 67%, avoided 82,000 hospitalizations. So it's really good data, really good outcomes that we've seen through the DME industry. But obviously, the NCD has changed the game a little bit. And so our focus in the last year has been on how do we get everything right for the NCD. So I'm also going to talk about some industry data because one of the things that we see, it's kind of across the board, is some vent providers, their compliance rates on their vent patients are in the 30s and some are in the 80s. And so there's a wide range of where people are at. We kind of attribute where we're at in ventilation right now and respiratory to where we were in sleep, 15 or 20 years ago, where we didn't have modems on every patient. They didn't work that well, trying to figure out how do we track this new compliance thing. And so the NCD, I would say is, if you've been in HME for long, then you recognize that it's all kind of predictable about what's going to happen next. And so when we first started doing ventilation, non-invasive ventilation in 2009, 2010, we were one of the first early companies to get into the non-invasive space, the company I was with, and we expanded across the country. We went from 30 vent patients in Tennessee to 4,000 or 5,000 across 26 states, and we expanded all with organic growth, no acquisitions. Back then, we were saying an NCD is coming very soon, and so it took a lot longer than I thought. But we knew that this day would come when an NCD would come and there would be new rules and regulations around non-invasive ventilation. So we've been preparing for this day for a long time. We didn't know what it would say, but we did recognize that there was going to be a need for compliance and a need for outcomes and a need to go beyond the box, as we say all the time. Like we get paid, we're the definition of fee for service in DME because we get paid for a device that we deliver to the home. But the challenge is that everybody that we provide care for, so all of our referral sources, physicians, hospitals, case managers, they're all in value-based models. They're all in unique payment models. They're under fee for service too, but they're all starting to get paid based on quality and reducing hospitalizations and different models. And so we got to start thinking about how do we sell to those models. And that's really where our platform comes in to say, how do we meet the needs of all the people that we're selling to so that our incentives are aligned? And in that, part of it is tracking data. And so that the NCD makes it obviously a little bit more difficult to get patients on ventilators, a little bit easier to get them on RAD devices, which we knew would be the case because obviously the challenge before was it was really hard to get on a RAD device. It's easier to get on a ventilator device. So we knew that that was going to flip. And we also, assumed that there was going to be some regulations around compliance. I'll be honest, I never imagined that the compliance regulations would be this strict. So the NCD has created the most strict compliance guidelines we've ever seen in the industry of ongoing compliance forever. But it's a lot of the things that we know, right? It's chronic respiratory failure for COPD patients. That's the focus of the new NCD. It's about documenting things like symptom improvement and blood gases, any of that. Not that you have to do that, but you got to have some documentation of symptom improvement or some kind of improvement in care. And then the compliance piece. And so you've got this emphasis now on outcomes and compliance that we've never had in the industry on a long-term ongoing basis. So in the past, it's been prove they're using it. Once we prove they're using it, then we'll pay you for it from a CMS perspective. This is the first time where we've seen a reg come out or NCD come out that says you've got to prove compliance forever as you're billing for a ventilator, and at least most of the time for a BiPAP patient or the times that the first 13 months, and then anytime you do resupply. So there's some challenges there. Now, one of the things that, could be some silver lining to this is UHC, Humana, some of those payers who have not been approving ventilation in the past, this kind of opens a door that they got to follow the new NCD. And so we'll see how that shakes out. We're seeing some movement there already, but this is going to open the door with some payers. It's going to make it more restrictive with others. And obviously we know that when CMS comes out with an NCD, usually commercial payers follow suit at some point in the future. So the timeline for the NCD is essentially it dropped on June 9th. The implementation date is the 22nd. So what does that mean? Well, if you depends on who you ask, right? So I'll tell you that the people we're working with, the providers we're working with, most of them are going with the October 22nd date because that's the implementation date. But there are some DMEs that are saying, hey, I'm going to make sure I'm following this NCD all the way back to June 9th, because the way that the wording is written, it says whatever policy was out on the date that you set up the device is the policy that CMS is going to go by, that the contractor is going to go by to do an audit. So there's an argument that says it could be June 9th, it could be the 22nd. 60% of the industry, from what we've seen, is going with the October 22nd date. About 40% is going with the June 9th date just to be ultra conservative. And so April 22nd, last month, was the date where we hit the first 6-month period. And so it's really when we're in live action now, right? And that first 6 months, you had to prove compliance, and then now you got to prove compliance every month. And so we're going to see more and more patients who are at that period coming up over the next several months. And then anybody that was set up after October 22nd is now under the new NCD. And so we've got to follow the new guidelines. Well, the new guidelines, one of the biggest challenges is that we're looking at compliance. The compliance rule is the same as what we've known for sleep for many years, right? 70% of the time, 4 hours or more. Now, what does that mean? Is there a study out there that says in ventilation, this is the magic number for chronic respiratory failure? The answer is absolutely not. There's no study, there's no data to back this. This is arbitrary, took the sleep rules and implemented under ventilation. The challenge with this is that if you look at the data, and again, we've got a unique vantage point on the data. You look at the data, it's very inconsistent, right? You've got patients who get in distress, they go on ventilation, they start to feel better. They don't use it as much. And so there's this kind of roller coaster effect that happens with ventilator patients that makes it really hard with this new rule because now they got to use it. And so historically, what most companies did before the NCD was as long as you're using it and as long as you've got some improvement or you've got some consistency, then they consider that compliant. Under this new rule, that's not the way it works anymore, right? We've got to follow the new guideline, and it's difficult, and we're seeing much lower numbers than I think anybody recognized in the ventilator space for compliance. And I'll show you some of those. The initial 6 month period. So in the initial 6 months, it's just like the sleep world. You got to find 30 days of compliance, 30 consecutive days that you get to that 70% mark, 4 hours or more in that first 6 months. So it can be a rolling time anytime in the 6 month period, and then you've proved compliance at 6 months. And then after that, then it starts to go into this whole cycle. So the first 6 months, you got to prove 30 days of compliance. 7 to 12 months, you got to have compliance every single month. And then ongoing after that, it's compliance every month. But then there's also this research process, which says that you've got to get the physician to sign off on each one of those periods. And so you've got the 0 to 6 month period, 7 to 12 month period, and then you've got beyond that. And so essentially what happens now is that you've got to go into the doc and show them, just like we do with sleep. The only difference is the face-to-face requirements a little bit different than sleep, but you got to go into the physician, show them they're compliant, either have them do a visit with the patient, can be face-to-face, can be telehealth, or it can also be that they're reviewing the data and signing off on that. And so essentially what we have now is the necessity to go back in at between 0 and 6 months to show 30 days of compliance. And then again, between 7 and 12 months. It doesn't say when in that period you have to go. So what we've done in our platform, for instance, is if you hit 30 days of compliance anytime in the first 6 months, then you're ready to go back and recert as long as you've got documentation of symptom improvements and that kind of thing too. Same thing in the 7 to 12 month period is that once you hit it and you've got a few months of compliance, then you can go back in. Is what most people are saying. The consensus is in the industry is that it doesn't have to be at the very end of 12 months because that would be really hard to do without a lapse in billing, coordinating patients, or your team going back in talking to the physician. So let's just talk, from a overall view. You got the initial setup, which has to follow the NCD now. Again, a little bit easier for RAD, a little bit harder for ventilation, but at least we've got a standard that we're following. You've got the 1 to 6 months or 0 to 6 months, which is you got to find 30-day period of compliance. Then you get the 7 to 12 months, which they're supposed to be compliant every month. And then you've got after the year. And so it's a little bit different from RAD to HMV. Under RAD, you only have to show compliance for the first 13 months. So after 12 months, you got one more month to show compliance to bill. And then after that, you only have to show compliance in the months that you bill for resupply. On ventilation, after the first 12 months, it's every single month. Really, after the first 6 months, it's every single month you have to show compliance or you can't bill. And it has to be in that billing period. So one of the challenges that people are up against right now is if you have an anniversary date, start a care date, and you set up that patient, then the compliance period is the same as your billing cycle. And so if I get audited in 5 years from now, how am I going to go back and pull that 1 month from the 15th to the 15th or the 17th to the 17th and be able to show compliance for that? And that's one of the things that a lot of the manufacturers haven't had answers for before, but we've seen that some of them are developing to that. I think one has come out with that recently. So that's something that they're building towards. But right now, is no great way to do that other than use a platform like ours. And so after the year, compliance forever on an HMV patient. If you're not compliant, you can't bill. And then for bilevel, only in the months that you do resupply. So obviously the financial impact as an industry could be huge, right? Especially knowing that compliance is much lower than we thought. It's much lower than sleep. And so the financial impact of this NCD says, if I go from every 100 patients I set up, if I'm really good and I'm at 75% compliance, I'm still losing lots of revenue. And I've got to deal with the issue of how do I pick up those patients, right? Am I going to get AMA? Is the doc going to sign an order to pick up a life-sustaining device? We've got that dilemma that we're up against that everybody's kind of trying to figure out how do we handle this because there's no guideline that says this is exactly how you do it. If they're not compliant for this many months, you pick it up. It's at your discretion of how you do that. So how long do you leave it out there to try to get them compliant and not bill? And then on top of that, how do you pick it up when it's time to pick it up? Because you've got the issue of it's a life-sustaining device that the doc wrote the order for, as well as the issue of, are you going to sign an AMA with a patient? So there's challenges that we're faced here that have really are unprecedented in the industry. And so that's why there's still a lot of push for clarification from CMS around some of these things. They put out some more Q&As just recently, but there's been some more requests back to them to say, hey, you got to clarify more of this. And they could with LCDs. LCDs obviously could continue to change and evolve. But one of the things from the frequently asked questions document that got put out, it was an HME business yesterday, I think. Yesterday an article came out, and these were kind of the three primary things that they answered, that CMS answered, and that they put an article out about in HME business, and that is that the ventilator data. So one of the challenges that the industry brought to CMS was, hey, we don't have connected devices on every patient, right? So modems don't work. Some of the ventilators out there are struggling with modems. And so right now, there's a lot of Philips devices out that don't have modems, and they can't get a new modem because they haven't come out with the next series of modem. And so there's a lot of patients out there that have a ventilator that don't have a modem. So how do we handle that? And that's one of the questions that came to CMS. CMS's response was that their policy does not state that the information has to come from the machine. So kind of vague, but here's how we've handled that and how we've seen others in the industry handle that is if you just call the patient or go see the patient and say, are you using this 40 hour or 4 hours a day, 70% of the time, they're all going to say, yeah, sure. Because that's an equation that they're not going to calculate in their head and know that I've used it on average 4 hours a day, 70% of the time. So the way we've handled this is to say that, yes, primarily it needs to come from the ventilator data. If we don't have the ventilator data, the next best thing would be if we don't have an API connection, so live data coming in, then the next best thing would be to do a download. So your respiratory therapist goes out, does a manual download like we've done in the past, and then now you've got live data. The third step would be to get patient reported data. And so this is the way we're handling this. I'm not giving you this advice to say this is the gold standard, but this is what I've seen as consensus in the industry is that yes, we'll ask the patient, are they using it? And are they using it the time periods that we say, but also looking at the hours to make sure that the right amount of hours have clicked off. So if I ask the patient, have you used it 4 hours a day, 70% of the time, and they say yes, and then I recognize only 4 hours clicked off since last month, then I know that that's not true. So I've got to do the calculation to figure out, have enough hours clicked off that could prove that what they're telling me is valid and what I've documented is valid. We believe that's the only way to do it, because if you just ask for a patient perspective, there's really good evidence that could say, that the hour meter hasn't clicked off enough, and so therefore you took patient reported data that could have been proven wrong, and you didn't prove it wrong. So I think that's the kind of standard that we should look at is how do we get patient reported data and then get machine data, at least with the hours, to back that up. Prospective billing is another big problem everybody's been talking about, right? We're on prospective billing model in HME. And so how do we look at the month's compliance if we don't have compliance yet for that month that we're about to bill for? And so the CMS document that just came out recently said that they understand that we're on prospective billing. This is not meant to change your billing standards. And they understand that the NCD usage requirements may not be met or known for that month. So that's the challenge, right? Is that if you go ahead and bill that and then you don't meet them, then you're in a pickle, or you've got to reverse that. Or if some companies I know have changed their billing systems to go back and say, okay, we're not going to do prospective billing on vents. We're going to do retrospective billing. And so that's an option too. CMS is saying you don't have to do that. But obviously, if you don't get patients compliant, then you've got to deal with reversals as well. And then the timing of the policy. So this is, again, what I said earlier. What they're stating is whatever the timing of the policy is, so whatever policy was in place on the date you set up a patient is the policy you follow. Now, that's where there's a discrepancy between June 9th and the 22nd of October, because theoretically the policy dropped on June 9th. So what about that period between June 9th and October 22nd? Which policy do we follow? Again, some people are following the old policy, some are following the new policy, the new NCD. based on that date. So that's going to be a decision that you as a company have to make. I can't tell you the best way to do it. I will tell you the majority of people are going with the October 22nd date because that's the implementation date. But there are some companies, again, that are being very conservative on that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, who we are, because I think this is important for the conversation. And then I'm going to talk about some of the data we're seeing from the industry, which is again, a good snapshot of what we're seeing out there, what's going on in the industry. So Encore, we've had software for about 7 or 8 years. The Nexus software that we license to companies that do ventilator management. So it's everything from, clinical assessments to managing your accreditation, clinical accreditation, to compliance, to a plan of care for the patient. How do we guide care for the patient to know what to do next? And then we have, in the last 3 or 4 years, started what we call telerespiratory services, where we come alongside of you, provide staffing, and help you manage patients inside of Nexus. So Nexus is the hub of all this, where all the data is stored. Think about, if we license Nexus to you, then essentially your team is being trained to use the software. It becomes your electronic medical record. It becomes your outcome system. It becomes your sales tool to go out and tell the story to the referral source. And then if we come alongside of you with telerespiratory services, it's kind of an add-on to say, hey, I want to use this outcome software, but also want Encore's team to come alongside of us through telerespiratory, telemedicine, and do some services. So we have oxygen programs, we have vent programs, we have vest programs. We have different options of how we do that, but it's all focused on outcomes, right? So we're not just a staffing service. You could get staffing services, somewhere else if you just want staffing. What we're doing is an outcomes play, right? So how do we manage patients? How do we manage outcomes and help you build a story to take back to the referral source? So one of the things that the power of Nexus is that we've got all these integrations. So we've got all this data flowing into Nexus. So from billing systems to ventilator systems to the ability to use Snowflake to interact with different customers. Tableau, all of our data dumps into Tableau, to things like Salesforce from CRM perspective. We've got all these integrations that allow us to become the hub in the home for not just ventilation, but for all things respiratory. So I'm going to talk about Compliance Hub, which is this new product that we've got out. And even if you are not using Compliance Hub or you're building something yourself, this will be a helpful conversation, because this is not just a sales pitch. This is to say, here's how we've solved a lot of these problems we're talking about. So our goal here is to be transparent, to say, look, I know not everybody's going to use our platform. I'd love it if everybody did, right? But everybody's not going to use our platform. But we all need to figure out how to solve these problems. And we've been working tirelessly on how to solve a lot of these issues. So you'll see as we go through this, kind of how we're looking at this, how we're solving problems. And even if you're building your own internal platform, this will be a helpful conversation to see what the industry's doing, to see how we're solving some of these things. But our platform is the world's first and only agnostic ventilator compliance platform. We have the ability to pull all data into one place so that you can make clinical decisions, compliance decisions, business decisions based on what's happening inside your business. It's the place where your therapists, your teams don't have to log into a million different platforms to pull compliance. Because here's the problem that I hear all the time, especially since the NCD. I hear providers telling me, hey, my respiratory therapists are out doing CPAP setups and ventilator follow-ups, and they're out in the field all week. And so by the time they get back to look inside of the manufacturer's software system to look for compliance, it's Friday afternoon or it's Monday morning. It's before they go out in the field for the week. So the problem with that is, in the past, that wasn't a big deal. With the new NCD, if that's a patient who was compliant and drops off, well, now all of a sudden that week of lost time because your therapist was out in the field doing their job, what you want them to do, now becomes a problem where you can't bill for that month because that patient dropped off and nobody saw it, right? So how do you create a process where all this is in one place, can be managed easy and seamlessly, so that you don't have to go log into a bunch of different places and figure out how to manage juggle all these different things. So our goal is to create uniform data set. All doesn't matter what device, but it all comes into a uniform data set. So we call it the same thing all the time. Everybody's got their own modes and their own settings and their own different terminology. We created uniformity in that terminology so that when you see it, you know what it is. And that took a lot of time. It took a long process. So Compliance Hub is what we've built, is an intelligent compliance management system that is constantly evolving. So if you see this today, in 3 months from now, it will look a lot different, right? Because we're actively have a team building this out, and this is our main focus: is how do we continue to move the needle on becoming and being the most intelligent compliance management system in the world. One of the things that you'll see here is up at the top, you've got all the aggregate data of what's your compliance on all your patients. How many patients do you have? How many of those have downloads that have been done or event downloads? How many of those are in each percentage category? So this is a good way to look at the aggregate, but also to look at all patients in one place. So one of the things that you see here is you've got the standard, compliance numbers of I got patients on different devices. When's the period? So that's the start of care period. And then I've got how many days do they use it, percent compliance, all those types of things. And then I'm going to continue to flip through some of these screens that just shows you some of the things that we have here. And again, even if you're not using Nexus, it's a good way to be thinking about how do you track this and how do you create systems around this. Inside of Compliance Hub here, you can see that it doesn't matter what device the patient's on, it's all coming into one place, right? So we've got all the different devices coming in. We've got if they're on HMV or if they're on a RAD. So the RADs are about to be turned on in the Compliance Hub as well. And so right now it's HMV, very soon RADs too. So anybody under the NCD policy will be able to be managed in one place. The usage here, is it coming from an API? So is it connected from a modem? Or if you do a manual download, or if you manually put in the data, it's all going to show up here. So no matter how the data comes in, an API, direct connection, a manual download, your respiratory therapist goes out, does a download, goes up into MultiView or Prism or any of those systems, and then it'll come over to Nexus. Or if it's a manual entry, right? Even if you didn't have the ability to do either one of those, but you got the data. So for instance, like ResMed doesn't have the ability to go up into AirView if you download it in the home because it goes on to ResScan. And so you'd have to type that data in potentially if you did a manual download. Even if you type it in, you're still going to get everything in the Compliance Hub. So no matter how the data is coming to you, it's all going to be in one place and you're going to be able to manage it. You're going to be able to see if they're compliant or not. You can filter here. So on all of these columns, you can filter, and I can look at who's not compliant, who's compliant. I can look at the period that they're in, and then I can also look at, this is a really cool feature, the cycle past. So that is episode state. So think about the first 6 month period, the 7 to 12 month period, and then beyond that. So I will be able to see here if I have passed my first 6 months of compliance and I've got that checked off on by the physician and I've got the recert, right? I'll also be able to see when the date that that's due. So as I'm logged in looking at this, I can sort by these dates and figure out who's coming up due. And then I can figure out what I need to do to get them all signed off on or back to see their physician, however you're going to handle that process. You'll see the same thing for the second cycle. So that's the 7 to 12 month cycle. When's it due and has it been done or not? So you've got a lot of power in being able to filter and sort data here to tell a story, identify problem patients. One of the other things that we have is we've got a lot of different fields that you can use and you can customize your view. So one of the things that we feel like is very powerful is that depending on how you like to look at compliance, you can look at usage or you can look at compliance percent. You can look at graphs if you want. We've got a bunch of different graphs, or you can look at changes in the last 2 days, compliance changes in 2 days, 3 days, 7 days, 14 days, and be able to see that. And if you pick one of those days, you can see here, this is in the last 14 days, this patient's gone up by 7%. So they've gone up a little bit. They're going the right direction, right? This patient stayed neutral. So you'll be able to see patients that are going up and down very quickly in whatever date frame you want. And once you customize your views, and now you've got a view of how you like to see compliance, and you can have different views. It's one of the things that we're building. I'll show you in a second. Is that we're about to release is these kind of bucket views, so you can look at different sections of patients and figure out what's going on with that group of patients. But the ability to filter and view is very advanced and allows you to see anything you want on all these patients. This is the episode state view. So one of the things that the challenges many providers are having right now is how do I track my existing patients that were grandfathered in, the new patients that are coming in, and then the patients who are in which cycle. So what we've done here is we've created these kind of buckets. And these buckets are, I can quickly filter by patients that are actively in the first cycle, the ones that have completed the first cycle, the ones that failed the first cycle that I really need to focus on, or the ones that are in the second cycles. I can also focus on or filter by the ones that are just ongoing resupply. So if it's a RAD patient, then I can sort by the ones that are ongoing resupply, and I can see what their compliance is, see if it's time to do resupply or if it's possible to do resupply or not. So again, we're going to have that data going. So on the buy level, a lot of questions around, well, how am I going to pull data just in the month? I want to do resupply and know when it's time. Well, if you've got this, then you've got all the data flowing all the time, and you don't have to worry about going to figure out if they're compliant. You just look in the dashboard, pull them up, filter on them, and then do resupply. So it makes it real simple. So the idea here is, how do we create simplicity around managing and a best practice around managing your population? So think about, with Compliance Hub, not only do you get this component, but you also get the vent checks and all the clinical assessments that come along with Nexus as well. Advanced features. I won't spend much time here, but I'll just show you that if I want to filter and search and I want to compare compliance, if you're a large company and you want to look at, is my compliance better on brioche units versus react units versus ResMed units, then you'll be able to filter and pull that. And so it'll be the ability to look at individually or the aggregate of your business. A lot of what we do, what I'm showing you here, is basically the patient view. All of this is going to go into aggregate dashboards where you can see the overview of what's happening with your patients, which devices are the best for your business, those types of things. So there's a lot of power in data that you get when you start to collect all this, plus all the clinical data all in one place, right? So not only do I know the compliance information, but also know what symptoms are for a patient and if they're improving or declining, if they're taking their meds. And if I build that whole story together, you've got a comprehensive story that nobody else out there has, right? So the idea of having this level of data says I can go into a CEO of a hospital system, or I can go into a payer and I could tell them a story about a business, your DME business, that essentially is not a normal story from DME, right? But this is the power of data. And the evolution of our industry is that at some point in the near future, I feel like we're at a tipping point. More and more people are doing data programs, doing stuff like this. At some point in the near future, it's going to become not the exception, but the norm. And I believe we're there now, that if you're not doing something like this, to be able to track data and outcomes and be able to tell things like readmissions and how much you've improved care for patients on top of just compliance, that it's going to be really hard to continue to be relevant in this industry. This is the patient dashboard. So this is not launched yet, but will be very soon. And this is essentially looking at an individual patient. So I can look at them over time. I can see where they're at in their cycle. I can see at what point I completed the first part of the cycle. And this graph in the middle here is a quick way, maybe not so good for colorblind people like me, but it's a quick way to be able to look and see where I'm at, right? Am I getting data? Are they compliant? At what point did I get the recert, or what's the date for the recert? And so I've got this at a glance of how am I doing over time. But I've also got, all their clinical information as well. I've got all the information up here about connectivity, days they've been in the program. And so then down here, I've got all the detailed view of the patient. So a lot of good information. I can quickly look at a patient and see where they at in the cycle. They passed their first cycle. When's the next one due? Here's when the next one's due. And I can figure out how am I doing to track towards that. But I can also look for trends in data. So if you want a detailed view, it's coming very soon. The other very powerful thing, and one of the challenges, is how do you do this kind of research process of going back to the physician and being able to show them they were compliant, show them symptom improvement, show them all the things you need for a RAD device. And so here is one of the examples of our new physician report. So if you know Nexus, anybody that uses Nexus right now, you get a physician report, has all the data that essentially about medications and hospitalizations and how the patient's doing, symptoms over time. These reports are a really good way for me to go to a doc and say, look, this patient's on non-invasive ventilation, but they really need to be on airway clearance. Here's why. Here's the symptoms they're having. Here's what they're telling me in the home. What do you think about trying them on a manual device or advanced therapy? So this is a report that allows you to go in and have those conversations. But now it includes, or in the near future, this next phase is we're launching this report. Essentially is going to include this section at the bottom that shows the NCD compliance. So as you see here, as you see here at the bottom, there's the first 6-month period. So you can easily show this, because one of the challenges that physicians have said is, how do we quickly, easily look at this data and be able to say, yeah, I agree and sign off on it, right? Well, this is the simplest way we could come up with is we've got the first 6 month period, we got the 7 to 12 month period. Up here, you've got a RAD section and an HMV section, and you've got check marks here for if they've met each one of those. If we have documentation they met that, it will be filled in. And then this is where the physician would check off on these things and then sign to show that you've got NCD compliance. So again, the idea of being able to easily take this in, say, hey, it's time for the 6 month research. And so now it's time to sign off on this. Maybe they want to see the patient, maybe they don't. That's up to them. But essentially, you've got the data you need to continue to bill for that patient, continue to service that patient, and keep them managed. Here's some best practice. So this is some of what we're seeing in the industry. I think that this is a very interesting viewpoint. And one of the challenges that we're up against right now as an industry, I'm going to outline a couple of those in this slide. So I'll pull a data set here. This is 2,280 patients being actively managed. Some of them very new patients, some of them been on service for a few months, but I pulled this report of new patients so I could just kind of show you one of the challenges that we're dealing with right now. And this is where looking at the industry as a whole, we've got a bunch of problems, holes that we got to start to fix together. And so if you look at this, here's how many patients you got, here's how many have been contacted. A lot of patients that it's hard to connect with. And that's one of the things that as we're managing patients with the DME, having to manage that together to say, how do we get connected with these patients? Because we have to, right? We gotta figure out how to get data from them. Here's one of the things that we're seeing across the board is that you've got a big number of patients with no data. And so this is no modems, this is no connection, bad service area, all those things. And so this is where, DMEs and us are having to work together continuously to say, how do we solve this? Because this is a really big number, 40% of the total. But this is what we're seeing across the industry is that there's a big number of patients with no data. How do we get that data? It's either you're going out to do a manual download so we can get the data, or it's going to be that we got to get modems hooked up. So modems are so important now. I would never put out another vent without a modem from this day forward. And so that is gotta be part of your process, because under this new NCD, it's going to cost you way more to not do modems than it would be to have modems. And connectivity is one of those things that we struggled with in sleep a while back. But now it's almost 100%, right? And so it's going to evolve. And I believe the manufacturer that conquers the modem issue the quickest is going to win the race, because right now there's a lot of connectivity issues out there. Can't connect. Modem's got a separate plug-in, so they unplug it to plug in their cell phone. And all the things, lost a modem because they moved, all the different things that we run into with separate modems for some of the older units and issues that we're dealing with today. So a lot of no data. Here's the point to that is to look at overall compliance, including the patients with no data on this data set I pulled. This is 41%, so that's very low. I would assume when I came into this process that we would see compliance in the 50s or above all the time. We've seen companies that had compliance in the 20s and 30s for their vent patients. So it's interesting to see the widespread. A lot of it, though, was not that their patients weren't using it. It was because they didn't have modems. They didn't have them connected. They couldn't get data, so we didn't know. So if you're looking at just overall picture of this snapshot, well, it's 41%. If you look at this one, just the patients we have data on, it's 69% and climbing drastically. So again, you're looking at a data set of all new patients that have come in the last 6 months into our service and are starting to climb. I'll show you how those climb here in a second, but essentially to point out the fact that there's a big gap that HMEs need to focus on, and that is how do we find these patients who aren't answering the phone, and how do we get data from patients who don't have modems, or get modems out there to the home, switch out their vent, whatever you got to do. Now's the time to be thinking about that, especially on all new patients. Here's what we see now in the bottom, the initial cycle. So these are the patients that are under the new NCD, 239 patients. In the second cycle, the 7 to 12 month cycle, there's 11 patients. So of this population, this snapshot that I pulled, there are 250 patients under the new NCD, so about 10% of the vent population. Now, I would say this is probably becoming pretty consistent with the national data, which says that, or if I was going to guess, I would say that the national data would tell us that about 10% of the vent population is now under the new NCD, because here's the deal. vent patients, COPD patients, stay on an average of 9 months in the United States. That's the average length of service. So as we can see that 10% now, in the next 6 months, it's probably going to be closer to 40 or 50%, right? So we're going to see that number climb very quickly in the next 6 months to 12 months because generally COPD respiratory failure patients don't stay on service that long unless you capture them early. So that means that that number is going to climb quickly, and you're going to see more and more patients in that category. Very consistent in the amount of compliance at the bottom here, 41% all patients, including the ones with no data, 55% in the patients that have data. Again, this is kind of a snapshot in time, but it tells a really good story that we're, as an industry, the numbers are much lower than a lot of people assumed. Now, with permission from Hometown, I got permission from them yesterday to share this because they are probably, one of our top customers who use our Vent 360 model, which is where we're helping them manage compliance together with them. And so what I asked him yesterday was, is it okay if I share this on this webinar? Because they essentially are some of the best data we're seeing. So what's the difference? The difference is that they are highly focused on how to solve the NCD. They're highly focused on making sure that all these issues, even though they've hired us to do this and to help them manage it, they've also been really focused internally of how they create processes around this to make sure that there's not an issue with no data. This is in upstate New York, where there's some rural markets there. And one of the things that people always say, well, I got way too many patients not connected because I'm in rural Tennessee or I'm in rural whatever. But this is proof that if done right, there is a very low no connection rate if you're doing this and managing the process. Now, that could be some of those are manual downloads. This doesn't mean that that many of the modems are connected, but what it does mean is that they're getting data on that many patients. So there's only 4 patients out of almost 100 with no data. That's pretty impressive. We don't see those numbers most of the time. Only 2 that have not been not been connected with. So we can't find 2 of the patients, and it may just be not yet because they're newer on service, or it may be that patients that change phone numbers, moved, whatever. So the same issues we all deal with, but this is very low numbers and percentages on both of these. But look at their compliance rates. 75% compliance for all patients, 79 for patients that we have data on. That's extremely high for the ventilator population. Some of the better numbers we see. We've got 1 or 2 other customers. One of them is actually on this call with us that are in the 80s that have been doing this with us for a long time. But essentially, what we see in the industry today is much closer to 45 or 50 across the board with the guys who have really been managing this and focused on this internally and working with us have gotten it into the high 70s and even 80s. And then you see at the bottom kind of where they're at with initial cycle, second cycle, and then the NCD process. So the point to all that is to say that in the sleep world, we expect compliance is going to be 70 plus in most businesses. In the ventilation world, even the literature, this is looking at literature over the last 20 years from Europe and from the US, says that ventilator patients usually is closer to 50% using the PAP compliance threshold. That is a challenge because that means we got an uphill challenge against us of how do we get more patients compliant. This is what happens over time as we've worked with customers is that this was a real world example, came in at 41%, 3 months, we're up to 55%. We don't have anybody that's been doing this compliance model for 12 months yet, but traditionally throughout Nexus, throughout our software, it's 73, or as you saw just a second ago above, or as I mentioned, some customers, the elite customers are even in the 80s. And so what we see is that over time, as you manage this process, compliance improves. That means that there is a drastic increase in revenue under the new NCD. This is a customer example. We just pulled a snapshot, 300 patients, and essentially we doubled their compliance in a short amount of time. And by doing that, we saved $148,000 a month in revenue of patients that they would have lost if they wouldn't have got them compliance, 1.7 million a year. So there's a big return by getting patients compliant. Moving the needle by a couple points on compliance in ventilation is going to be much bigger impact than moving the needle a couple points in the sleep world. So that's why we've got to get ahead of this because it's going to be a problem. I'll throw out one more thing is that one of the things we've seen is that when you use an outcomes platform like this, you get patients on earlier. You manage patients, you engage patients more, they have less reasons for pickup, and you have better compliance. It keeps patients on longer. So the national average for ventilation, like I said, for non-invasive ventilation for COPD, patients stay on about 9 months. So if you had 100 ventilator patients and they normally stayed on for 9 months, I don't know. I've asked a million providers this question: how long is your average length of service on your vent patients? Most of the time, the answer is I don't know. But this is a number that can be impacted, and it can be impacted in a big way. Here's the proof. The average Nexus user is at 26 months. That's a 17-month increase from the national average. So if you just think about what that means, revenue and clinical outcomes wise, is that that's $1.36 million in additional revenue on those same 100 patients. Now, if you continue to grow your patient base, then it's going to grow faster because you're not going to have as many pickups. And this happens over time, but you're talking about a huge ROI in these numbers of 40x after you paid for a service like ours. So its outcomes are the future. It's what everybody we're selling to cares about, but it's also an organic growth engine for your business. So not just compliance, but also just using outcome software. We've proven time and time again that there's a huge return for your business. You start to put big numbers in there, thousands of patients, and you're talking about, 100 million plus dollars that we're looking at in improvements over time as you get to those numbers. So just to kind of tell you real quick, and then I'll close out and we'll answer questions. The way that we work with DMEs is that we have a couple different ways. I talked about earlier, we've got software and then we have service model. So you can either license our software and use it yourself and get all those features I just talked about. Or the other option is we come alongside of you. And that's why this is important, because a lot of companies have come to us and said, hey, I just don't know how to conquer this NCD. I need help. I need you to do it for us. And we can't do it all for you, but we can help to kind of coordinate the process. And we're figuring this out as we go too. But this has been our primary focus, and so our goal is to continue to perfect it. We'll skin our knees along the way, just like everybody else, but we're going to continue to perfect it, and we're going to continue to become the most intuitive, but also the most comprehensive compliance management model that's out there now. We do just straight up compliance where it's just management by exception. We do full blown models where, the DME can set up the patient, and then we do a lot of the follow ups through telemedicine, track a lot of the data, the hospitalizations, you get all the outcomes. Or we even have a rental model where you can rent the vent through us. So you get software services and event rental, one bundled price every month. So we've got a lot of different options. One of the other things is everybody's thinking about under the NCD is how do we start to look at patient acquisition when maybe the funnel is getting smaller because less patients qualify for vents, more for BiPAPs, and you need several BiPAPs to make up for one vent. But then also the idea that a lot of people don't think about is that if you manage the whole patient, a respiratory patient, from nebulizer all the way through, your nebulizer patient is your future oxygen patient, your oxygen patient is your future vent and vest patient. Not every patient's going to end up all the way on a vent and vest, but a big percentage will. And if you start to manage them early and start to do programs, then what we've proven is clinical management of those patients helps to identify the right therapy at the right time for the right patient. And so what we see is every 1,000 patients that we run through this process, about 100 that need ventilation, 95 that need airway clearance. So there's a big percentage of oxygen patients that are out there that really need services that you offer today. How are you identifying those patients? And that's one of the other things that we do is help you figure out through data and algorithms and clinical outreach, how do you identify those patients and get them on the right therapy at the right time? Because historically in the US, what we see is that patients don't get referred respiratory products until it's way too late. It's usually end of life, and it's at the point where they're thinking hospice or palliative care, and we could have got them on earlier, because what we see in the data is that same patient went to the hospital 5, 6, 7 times for chronic respiratory failure or for reoccurring pneumonias. And nobody caught that if we would have put them on this therapy, that we could have solved that from happening. So the whole idea being that if you manage patients earlier, you're not mining patients, but you're clinically managing patients. And when you do that, you're going to identify gaps in care, and you're going to figure out how do I get the right patient on the right therapy at the right time and avoid those 5, 6, 7 hospitalizations from ever happening. So the story is that what we see is that outcomes are the future. Outcomes are necessary now. Compliance is necessary now with this new NCD. And so if you're not doing something about this, then you have to, because it becomes an organic growth engine of how do you sell your business? How do you manage your business? How do you maintain the patients that you have and not lose all that revenue? And then how do you continue to scale in this world that requires us to be more and more business minded and more clinical minded to be able to continue to operate in the HME space around respiratory patients? So I will pause there, and I know we got some questions coming in.
All right, thank you, Zach. We had two questions in the chat so far. Jamie is also unmuted, so he can chime in as well. Jamie Caputo, our VP of Sales, by the way. Number one question was during the you were talking about the compliance timeframes, NCD compliance timeframes. Someone asked if someone loses compliance in month 8, will they pay again if we get compliance in month 9? And what about 13th and 14th months?
The answer is yes. So the NCD doesn't say that. So basically, the let me say this: the comments that we got from CMS and from billing experts is the consensus that I've seen in the industry is that yes, you can. And so if you got to get compliance in the first 6 months for sure, 30 days to continue to bill after that. There's no language around what do you do if you don't get it the first 6 months? What's the start over look like? So we don't know what that language is. The assumption is you have to go back, get a new script, start over from the beginning. I don't know that there's any clarification around that yet. But what we do know is when you get to 7 to 12 and beyond, that if you don't get compliance, then you don't bill for that month, right? But it doesn't say that you can't continue to try to get the patient compliant. So the question most people are trying to figure out is how long do I do that, especially after the 12-month period. So now you just got to show compliance every month. If you miss a month, you just don't bill for that month. And then you got to decide as a company how many months are you going to miss? And is the patient making progress? And is there improvement before you try to figure out how to do asset retention or asset retrieval and pick up that patient? So it's a question that you got to answer as a company yourself, but you definitely can bill. Same thing on the buy level. On a buy level, it's a capped rental, right? So it's 13 months. If you miss a month in there, so I missed month 8, then you push back the cap rental is what most of the consensus is in the industry is that you can still bill for 13 months. It might take you 15 months to get there because the patient drops off compliance some of those months. So there's some complications in how you do that in billing, but that's the advice that I've been given from the industry, from billing experts, is that's the way you would handle that.
All right. Thank you very much. If you have a follow-up question on that, just drop it in the chat or send me a direct message. Second question came along and said, will ResMed be connected through an API or will that need to be done manually?
We've got some things in the works there. So if you're right now, there's no API, but there's conversations happening with ResMed. I mean, what we're hearing from customers, to be honest, is that if you're using a ResMed device, it's a lot harder to manage patients in this new world, right? Because of the fact that you can't get it into Nexus, and so they're having to go to a separate system. We do have some workarounds that we're doing. So any of our current customers, if that's somebody currently working with us, get with me and we'll show you how we can still do that by you pulling some of that data. But essentially, it's a longer process, right? Because we don't have a direct API. So the challenge right now is that we need ResMed to agree to do that integration, and they have not yet. So that's the one device that we're struggling with. But again, we can still get the data. It's just not through an API, and it's a little bit of a manual process on our side. So we're still getting it for our existing customers, but we're hoping that conversation evolves.
And we do have connectivity with the others.
Yeah.
Another question, third question came in. Is this NCD for traditional MC only, or do the Medicare replacement plans follow the same guidelines?
Medicare replacement plans will follow the same guidelines. They have to follow the CMS guidelines, so they will.
That is all the questions we have in the chat so far. Again, everybody's welcome to drop a message or a private message to me.
Yeah, hi everybody. Great showing today. Thanks for all the customers that participated and a lot of other familiar names that I see from across the country. One other comment I'll just make about on the ResMed side. So our customers are currently managing with Nexus or with our telerespiratory services with those devices. It is being done either through a manual process or behind the scenes. What we have been able to do is to be able to run a report on behalf of the customer and then dump that information into our system. So honestly, as a customer, you're not going to see that much of a difference from a report base, but it's more work on our end. And as Zach was mentioning, we have been having some conversations with ResMed and very helpful. They're receptive to it. I think it's just a matter of timing. Looks like there's one more question in there, Joe. Maybe.
So yeah, somebody just said we are not seeing the Medicare replacement plans following the new rules. Maybe 1 out of 10 was a comment.
Well, it's usually a delayed process, but the way that Medicare replacement plans work is that they have to follow the CMS guidance, but it may not be right away. So one of the challenges that I've seen in the industry that maybe you're talking about is Humana and United Healthcare still denying patients based on their old policy. And I've seen some companies actually be successful in pushing back on that, saying, "Hey, this is what the new NCD says. This is what we're supposed to follow." So there's definitely going to be some lax in the time or some lapse in the time of how long before they all catch up, but they all should be following that. Doesn't mean that they will, and doesn't mean that it'll happen right away. But generally speaking, that's the way that it works. That if you're a replacement plan, you have to follow the same guidelines as Medicare. So what we'll see is there'll be some pushback. Maybe they'll deny some things. You as a provider need to push back to them. Say, hey, this is the new NCD. What I'm confused on what we're following here. And I've seen those get overturned where they have turned around and followed the NCD. I don't know that they changed their policy because changing a policy inside of a big health plan takes a long time. But that's the way it should work. Anybody else have questions?
I would add one thing that we did not mention on the presentation today, and it was really meant to talk about what the NCD is about, give everybody a refresher of what we're currently seeing, and then also give you a little bit of background on what Encore does. One thing we did not mention is that we also do population health, and we actually have some programs that we have done in certain states. We actually have one right now that's being piloted in Florida for several Medicaid programs that are down there. It is a really exciting part of our business that we view. It's going to be a win-win all around, win for the patient, obviously, but it's about managing their respiratory conditions, and it'll also be benefiting the HME provider too, because we're going to be obviously managing some of these patients who might actually be on ventilators as well. Zach, I don't know if you want to mention anything else about that.
Yeah, I mean, the population health side is to say, hey, we as an industry, I started this as a DME back in several years ago. As a DME, I was saving the insurance company millions and millions of dollars, and they were not paying me for it, just like you are today. If you're using Nexus or if you're providing really good service, you're saving millions of dollars for the insurance companies, and they only pay you for the box that you deliver. And I don't mean to downgrade the devices we use, but I'm just saying in general, they're paying you for the device you deliver. And so the strategy we started years ago was to say the insurance company is really getting all the benefit of this utilization reduction of what we do. So we need to go directly to them and show them the value. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important to have outcomes data and the results like we've got inside of Nexus, because our DME partners now can go to their payers and say, look, you're paying me for this device and you're trying to squeeze a nickel out of me on every device that I put out, but I'm saving you millions of dollars on the other side of the house. I need to talk to somebody on the medical director side or on the pop health side to talk about what we're doing here and to really get paid for the outcomes that we're providing. And so we've been successful in doing that. And we've got some pilots going now. We've done it with several Medicare Advantage plans in the past, Medicaid plans, commercial plans, ACOs. So the whole idea of, there's these groups out there in the DME industry who are really partnering with payers and then forcing DMEs to partner with them. Right. And I won't mention any of their names, but there's a lot of that going on, the middleman kind of process where they get the deal with the payer, they force you to contract with them. Our strategy is much different. It's how do we work together with the DME, help to elevate the data and the outcomes, tell the story, and then let's go to the payers together and let's say, hey, look, we can manage patients, not just products. And when we get paid for patients and products, then we're really making the margins that we should be making, and we're able to provide the outcomes that benefits the patient, right? So, imagine a world where you get paid to be in the home already, per patient per month or some kind of fee. And then also you get paid for the equipment on top of that. It changes the whole game. Right now, our incentive is to take care of patients and not just to provide devices. And of course, that's always our incentive. But really, the more you take care of patients in this industry today, the less profit margin you make. So the better service you provide, the less money you make. So the guy that provides no service makes more money than all of us that provide really great service. That's a challenge. It should be flipped. It should be that if you're providing great service, you're making more money than anybody because we're taking care of the patients. That's what our pop health model is about. And that's really where, this starts with ventilator patients and outcomes and data. And then builds to how do you sell that to your referral sources? And then the next phase of that is builds to how do we then take this data to a payer and say, look, we're doing something nobody else is doing. Why would you ever think about using anybody but us? And you should be paying us for the outcome. So it's this idea of creating stickiness of if you are a provider providing the best care in the industry and you can prove it, then we should be shouting it from the rooftops and people should be paying you for it. And so that's really the concept of where we're going and where we're at right now with the Nexus platform.
All right, thank you. We got one more question that came in. Must the 30 days always start with the 19th if the patient is initiated then? And what to do for the months where it is initiated on the 29th through the 31st, since some months don't have those days? And then also, is there any grace for when the 30 days lands on a weekend?
Well, that's a very complicated question that everybody's been trying to solve. So the way that most people are solving that, I'll just give you kind of general advice, is that the start of care date is on the 28th, 29th, I'll say. And so some months don't have a 29th, right? And so you've got this challenge. Most people are keeping consistently the date that was set up, the start of care date, and then that same date each month, right? Some days maybe 31, some maybe 28. It's the Medicare definition is the date plus 30. But billing systems like Brightree and others, they do that calendar date each month, start of care to the next calendar date. And if there's not that month, it goes back a day. So you still bill in February, for instance, on the 28th instead of the 29th. So that's how the billing systems generally work, is that they're going to go off, 28, 28, 28, every single month. And that's how we solve it. But you've got some dynamics in this ventilator guideline that are a struggle. And one of those is, number one, how do you get compliance for the 28th to the 28th if some of the manufacturer systems don't allow you to do that? You get audited in 5 years, you got to go back and pull that 1 month. You can't do it in some of the systems today. And so how do you get that? And that's where our system would come in to help with that. But then the other nuance is, what happens if that patient goes to the hospital for a week and now they get out of the hospital and it's right in the middle of your, billing cycle? You can't bill because you're not going to have compliance on that month. So then it becomes a moving target potentially, where you have to move the start of care back to or to the day after the hospitalization. So there's some nuances here with this billing piece that are complicated and are very much going to be a decision that your company has to make yourself on how you're going to do it. But there's a lot of people out there that are trying to solve this same issue, and we can help kind of advise you on what we're seeing. We're not a billing consultant or giving billing advice, but I can just tell you what we're seeing in the industry and how other people are solving that. I think I answered all parts of that question. Did I miss part of it, Jamie or Joe?
Yeah, you answered it all.
Well, thank you guys for sticking around to the end. I think almost everybody stuck around to the end, and
Yeah.
appreciate everybody being on. It's a great turnout. We only announced this a couple of weeks ago, so great turnout. We'll be doing more of these on a monthly or bi-monthly basis. We'll be getting out data around how do you manage with outcomes, how do you grow the respiratory business, how do you continue to evolve what you're doing, and how do you manage this NCD? Because there's going to be more and more information, more and more strategies, and more data, and we'll be able to show you best practices. So we'll continue every couple of months to do something about the NCD, just so you can see kind of how's it evolving as an industry, how's compliance improving, and what are we seeing out there? Because we want to help raise the tide throughout the industry of how do we all win, whether you're a customer or not. How do we all win in this ventilation space? And we want to be there for you. So if anybody has questions, even if you're not one of our customers and likely not to be, we're happy to set up some time, talk to you. Doesn't matter either way. We just want to be a advocate for the industry and for the patient. So let us know if you need our support. Reach out to myself or Jamie, and we'll get you connected. Thank you guys so much for the time.
Thank you, everybody.